We hope you enjoy the following video presentation sponsored by the C.S. Lewis Foundation. We are a nonprofit organization with a mission to equip and encourage Christians to live their faith within the world of ideas and arts. To help us continue to host events and make videos like this one, please make a donation after viewing the video by going to www.cslewis.org or clicking the link below. Thank you.
But we do need to do a little time travel. We need to go way back to the 1500s, but if I was giving this talk in the United States, I would have to say we'd need to go across the pond. But here all we need to do is go down the road to the 1500s. Late at night, in the year 1523, the lobby of St. Dunstan Church on Fleet Street, down there in London. After listening to a preacher's evening sermon and saying goodbye to their friends, a preacher and a businessman strike up a conversation. They take an interest in each other and they set out into the night streets of London, and as they pass the flickering lights of the street lamps, they become more and more and more interested in each other, a businessman and a preacher on a street in London. But can we take a break from our history walk and go back in time? What was happening in history? It was the first wave of the Reformation. It had come 7 years earlier when Martin Luther posted his 95 Theses on the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg. Everybody knows that as 1517. Luther translated the New Testament into German in 1522, but German was not English, and that didn't help the people on the streets of Cambridge or Oxford where we've been. Back to our late night walk. A business leader and a preacher on Fleet Street in London in the 1500s. The business leader, I doubt that if I asked for a show of hands, there'd be more than 2 hands of anybody who'd heard of the wealthy cloth merchant. Cloth like this was his trade. His name was Humphrey Monmouth. How many have heard of Humphrey Monmouth? There we go, 1, 2 hands. Oh, 3, because he's my friend. The preacher? Everybody's heard of him. William Tyndale. He played a significant part in the Reformation. He was young, educated where we were last week in Oxford, learned Latin and Greek and Hebrew, and he wanted to translate the Bible into English for everyday people to read for themselves. That's encouraging to me personally because my son Carson is up at Regent College in Vancouver studying Hebrew and Greek. And his dad, the business guy, that would be me, keeps saying, "And what are we going to do with this?" And I keep thinking, William Tyndale. The Church of England thought that practice of everyday people reading the book for themselves was unhealthy, to put it mildly. Scary for a business guy like me to talk to a group of scholars like you because everything I say I feel like I didn't get it quite right. But let's just say the Church of England was not happy that the Bible would be translated into English. Is that fair? But this one night, in a church like this, Tyndale had done his sermon. I'm guessing he was a little discouraged. And I know for sure the facts say he was out of money. Their conversation continued. Monmouth was totally beginning to be taken by this young preacher, Tyndale. Tyndale had been rebuffed by the church for a huge project that he had in mind. At the time, there were only a few partial translations of the Bible in play in England, as you know. Tyndale was a reformer. He was a critic of the church. He lived a life of a man on the run from the religious leaders and government officials. He wanted to translate the Bible directly from the Hebrew and Greek, bypassing the Latin to be more accurate. He would take advantage of a new technology when he was done. It wasn't an iPhone. It wasn't Google. It was the printing press. The result would be the first of the new English Bibles of the Reformation. That was his plan. So what would you do if you were a religious worker, pastor, priest, and you had a plan, and you worked in a denomination? You would go to your leadership, and they said, no deal. Bishop Tunstall said, no deal. Tyndale asked for a place to stay. Tunstall, no deal. He asked for some money. Tunstall, no deal. He denied all his requests and said, Tyndale, suggest you look for employment elsewhere. Back to the church, late at night. Back to the walk. Humphrey Monmouth, the business guy, the cloth merchant, decided to take a risk. He quickly saw that Tyndale needed money, food, clothing, and a place to stay where he would not be discovered. So he did what you and I would do if we were in this business guy's shoes. I did it to my wife the other day. I called her up and said, 10 people coming for dinner tonight. Don't try that at home. Monmouth somehow sent his people ahead to home and said, we're going to keep this young preacher guy Tyndale at our house for 6 months. That's a little longer than one dinner. We're going to pay his salary so he can live. We're going to clothe him. Won't be too hard. I make cloth. We're going to feed him. And I'm going to call my friends, Monmouth said, a secret society of London merchants called the Christian Brethren, who invested in literature that was kind of contraband at the time. They were under the radar. They financed and imported things, had a lot to do with the cause of the Reformation. Whole group of businessmen, the Christian Brethren. They hatched a plan so when the Bibles were translated and printed, they would use their ships to smuggle the contraband Bibles throughout England. So Tyndale's personal financial support came from the Christian Brethren, as did the money to print the Bibles. The religious and government pressure increased, however. The bounty hunters were after Tyndale. He was a man on the run. He had to flee to Europe, as you know, to continue his work. He escaped, made his way to Germany, to the city of Worms, and the New Testament was published. But somehow it had to get back across the channel. 6,000 copies were printed and smuggled back into England in 1526, a couple years after Tyndale met Monmouth. How did it happen? The freshly printed Bibles were smuggled into England in the bundles of cloth on the ships that were the basis of Humphrey Monmouth's work. His friends also hid them in bales of cotton and sacks of flour. So there's an old movie, you know those movies that nobody watches, that somebody made and aren't really all that great, that some documentary thing, and you can see them pulling the Bibles out of the sacks of flour, pulling the Bibles out of the bits of cloth. So I wish I could tell you that I brought along a Tyndale Bible, but I just brought along a facsimile Tyndale Bible. So in these bundles of cloth, the object of the businessmen's work were Bibles hidden to bring back to England, and they were the spark that lit the Reformation. So, you say, what does all this have to do with our notion of business? Well, by the way, little cool fact, you can see one of the original 2 copies of the Tyndale Bible in London. I think they bought it for about $1 million. And if you have a spare 70 or 100,000, you can buy a 1549 Tyndale Bible on the internet. So I had the pleasure of having one of them the other day in a talk, when I did this talk, and had one of the $50,000 versions, which was about 7-8 years out from printing. That elicits a gasp. This is just a facsimile, but you get the idea. So Tyndale's work was the basis of the King James Authorized Version. It was completed 10 years after Humphrey Monmouth supported him with his friends in the Christian Brethren movement. That's a long-term commitment to missions, is it not? There were men and women in the Christian Brethren Society with Humphrey and all their spouses who used their companies to leverage this idea, this big idea that business people like. Big ideas, big plans, and it was funded. The result? We all know. Tyndale's work tilted the course of history. It's still felt today in 2017. Monmouth, by the way, ended up in prison in the Tower of London. How many of you are givers to a ministry? Probably every hand would go up. Has anyone gone to jail for their contribution? Time is coming. But it came for Humphrey Monmouth. He had to talk his way out of the Tower of London. As we know, 1535, Tyndale was arrested. October 1536, he was strangled and his body burned at the stake, and his last prayer was, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes." In 2 years after their deaths, the King of England ordered every parish church should receive their own copy of the English Bible. I'm not exactly sure when this church began, but maybe this is one of the places. Within 75 years, the King James authorized an updated English translation. 80% came from Tyndale's work. Today, almost 500 years later, the King James Bible has become what could be the most influential book in the world. The English Bible you read and carry is also carried by 600 million other English speakers and is built on the Tyndale work. We all know the name Tyndale, but it's time we remembered the guy behind Tyndale. His name is Humphrey Monmouth. It was a business leader. If we're not careful, we could see this story as a business leader supporting missions. Way to go, Humphrey. You supported missions. That whole thing you did with business was kind of the ATM machine that dispensed the cash. The real work was Tyndale. Well, the fact is, the Bibles would have never been translated or printed or distributed without Monmouth. Without his business making deals, selling cloth, being profitable, being excellent at what it did, loving people, serving customers, exporting, importing, working with government, the Bible would be another great idea that was a ministry great idea that never came to be. The theology of the matter is that doing business, Humphrey's business, the cloth business, in and of itself glorifies God. The cloth he sourced and made and sold glorified God, period. Even if he never gave 10 cents to Tyndale. Don't miss the mission in his merchant work. Don't miss the mission in his strong margins. Don't miss the mission in his loving employees. Don't miss the mission in his loving customers. Don't miss the mission in his making beautiful cloth. All of these things glorify God in and of themselves. Yes, it's true, no Tyndale, no translation. But I say this, no textiles, no Tyndale. No ships, no scriptures. No business, no Bible. No return on investment, no Reformation. Well, what do you make? Do you make students? Do you make things? Do you write books? Do you give talks? Do you traffic in ideas? Don't miss the mission in the work you do, as Helen so aptly just shared with us. You're not an ATM machine for missions. Your business is your mission. Your work is an act of love, giving people dignity when they produce things. Just some thoughts as to what happens when we work. Work is a place for otherness and community. That whole notion that when we go to a place and interact with each other, that's a good thing. My daughter one time worked as a photographer, and she said the worst part for her was editing the photographs because she had to sit alone in her home office editing for days and days, and it was killing her because she loves people. That's missing community. Work serves the common good, not just by advancing ourselves. Work allows people to be creative because God is creative. Imagine this scenario for a minute. If God is creative and created us in his image, that means we are also creative. So when you as a leader might take away the creativity of one of your subordinates by telling them what to do all the time, maybe they're going to quit pretty soon because they're tired of not being able to be creative under your leadership where you're the only one who has the creative gene. God is creative. He made your people creative. Let them be creative. Does it really matter if the cover of the program is green or red or yellow, if the font is 12-point or 14-point, if it's sans serif or Sergei or name the one? It probably doesn't matter unless you're really great at what you do and your subordinate is really horrible at what they do. I'm not advocating for poor work. I'm just saying good work versus good work when it's only an opinion is not worth taking away somebody's creativity for. Work is loving people in the process of doing the work. Work makes culture better. Work makes life function. It connects the human race. It transports people. It entertains people. The work we just saw was incredible in and of itself. The work Max McLean did for us the other night was breathtaking. But so is your work as whatever you do. Work makes life function. God and his partners, Holy Spirit, Jesus, the Trinity, worked to create earth, worked to create us. Adam and Eve worked in the garden. They worked after the garden. We work right now on earth, and we are too, and we will work in heaven. Work, 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 work. Timeline that. It's always there. It doesn't go away. We don't get to heaven and everything in our clothing wardrobe turns white. No tide needed. Not convinced? Check out this book called Work by Lester DeCoster. Work is where we make ourselves useful to others. Look at I would add the word pew. He says chair. Look at the pew you're sitting in. Want to make it for yourself? How would you get the wood? Go fell a tree? Only after first making the tools to fell a tree, only after making the road to bring the wood home from the forest. In short, it would take a lifetime or two to make one chair. It would take me 3 lifetimes. I can't screw a screw into a drywall. We couldn't make for ourselves from scratch, even a fraction of all the goods and services we call our own. Our paycheck turns out to buy us more than we could possibly make. Imagine that everyone quits working right now. What happens? Civilized life melts quickly away. Food vanishes from the shelf. Gas dries up at the pumps. Streets are no longer patrolled. Fires burn themselves out. Communication services end. Utilities go dead. Those who survive are all soon huddled around campfires, sleeping in caves, clothed in raw animal hides. The difference between a wilderness and a culture is simply work. Have you thought about that? It's easy. We just run across the street, run into the back, grab a cup of coffee, but someone had to grow the beans, transport the beans, grind the beans, figure out how to plug in a plug, make hot water, and pour it over. Unless you're a millennial, it takes 5 times longer, and you weigh the beans and you measure the beans. My son just moved out. He got married last week. I cleared out 2 cupboards of coffee-making things. I have one thing left. It's a jar of instant coffee. It's much faster. Dorothy Sayers says this: "In nothing has the church so lost her hold on reality as her failure to understand and respect secular vocation." I love that we're in England and she's an English person writing this work. We've allowed religion and work to become separate compartments. Is it really astonishing? How can anyone remain interested in religion that seems to have no concern with 9/10 of life? The church's approach to an intelligent carpenter is usually confined to exhorting him not to be drunk on Sundays. What the church should be telling him is the very first demand that his religion makes upon him is to make good tables. Those of you at Ely Cathedral yesterday saw the work that was over 300 years to hoist beams so big not one person could ever lift them, to create a thing of beauty unparalleled, one of the wonders of the world. Workers made that happen. Still not convinced? How about we do an American example from today? Martin Spence. How'd you like this on your business card? Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policy, 2012 to 2015. The difference from my church, he writes, to the office that I occupied at the Pentagon was 5 miles. For most of my time in government at the Pentagon, it might as well been 5,000 miles. On Sunday morning, I prayed for peace in church. I contributed to the collection basket, asked God to help the Syrians fleeing from their homes. Then I went back to plan for war. As Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Middle East Policies, my job included evaluating missile deployments, missile strikes, in the very place the Bible talked about. Where I worked, I had to pass through 2 locked doors. I had to check all electronics that could be used as recording devices. I also had to check my religion, I thought. It was inappropriate to broadcast my Christianity. We were considering matters of national security. Something happened one time, however, and I started to think of myself as a Christian at the Pentagon instead of a Christian at church. I realized I could do more for those refugees from my position at the Pentagon than I could with my modest contributions to the offering basket at church. So I covenanted with my colleagues at the State Department and the Human Rights Bureau and the U.S. Agency for International Development and outside human rights groups and the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States of America at how the Pentagon could better support their work. I visited refugees at a camp in Jordan and along the Syrian border, discussed their needs with my counterparts in Israel, Jordan, and Turkey. How'd you like that for a job? We spoke of education for their children, jobs for their men, camps that were wretched. We used military cargo planes to deliver food and other assistance. My Christian faith gave me discipline, courage, and inspiration to do more. Could you do more? Maybe you're retired and you would say, my work time is over. Well, maybe you could begin to build these concepts into your children and grandchildren. Still not convinced? How about a medical doctor? His name is Dr. Wayne Hay. He's one of our Convene members. We've got 500 CEOs and 50 groups that meet from coast to coast, and now Canada and Belize. Dr. Wayne Hay is in Texas. He's a urologist. He's one of the top urologists in the United States. He's the physician of the year in the state of Texas. And when you go see him for your issue, there's a sign that says, Dr. Hay will pray with you upon request. His Christian faith is known far and wide. But not everybody knows that Dr. Hay had a little passion. We all do, that's fine. He had 100 classic cars that he'd collected, parked in a warehouse. Just collecting them. Kind of a Jay Leno thing, minus the fancy garage. They all needed work. He's working his practice. No time to do cars. Through the work that happened with his brothers and sisters in his Convene group, he decided to donate all of the vehicles back to a foundation he created. That's $1 million worth of vehicles. And the Crossover Restoration Foundation's mission now is to restore lives one car at a time by modeling biblical values and teaching skills to out-of-work Hispanic kids in Dallas to teach them how to restore cars. And while they do that, they introduce them to Jesus. Now be careful. Don't say that that was better than the urology practice. The urology practice gave him the return on investment to do the car restoration business, and they're both equally important. Could you do more? George MacDonald died in 1991, not too far from here either. He was a Scottish soldier, a clergyman, a founder of a community called Iona. He started Iona because he saw this gap. It's kind of like a gap that still exists today. He didn't solve it. It's a gap between the church and the workplace. He got students and pastors and the unemployed to work together, and he connected the church to the industrial age. He's one of the best known, most influential, and unconventional, I love that word, unconventional Scottish ministers of the 20th century. And it's great to share this poem he wrote from the place that I'm standing. Because as you look behind me, you'll see two candles. Listen to this. George MacLeod. I simply argue that the cross be raised again at the center of the marketplace, as well as on the steeple of the church. I'm recovering the claim that Jesus was not crucified in a cathedral between two candles, but on a cross between two thieves. On the town's garbage heap, at a crossroad so cosmopolitan, they had to write his title in Hebrew and Greek and Latin. At a kind of place where cynics talk smut and thieves curse and soldiers gamble. Because that's where he died, and that's what he died about. And that is where churchmen ought to be, and that's what churchmanship ought to be about. The crucifixion did not take place here. It took place out there. It certainly did not happen if there was a cross over here between two candles. It happened out there. That's where I'm calling you to be. To be a representative of Jesus Christ, an ambassador at whatever you do, not to pull a tract out of your pocket, but that's okay too, but to be the hands and feet of Jesus in whatever you do. Lewis said, meanwhile, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow is Monday morning. Millions of people got up and went to work today all across planet Earth. Most of them, according to statistics, hate their job. The church is to be the church, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, not only on Sunday at 11 a.m. So I love what Lewis says, the cross comes before the crown, and tomorrow it's Monday morning. So let's get out there and be what Jesus wants us to be on Monday morning. Thanks.